going to drop you like just after the beginning to give you a little context. The narrator's a 9-year-old boy. Some of these stories are written by young people. I really like the voice of young writers or young narrators because kids are really transparent. They just say what's on their mind and they don't bother sugarcoating it, just spell it out. The 9-year-old boy, his brother Michael has just returned from the war in Vietnam. His brother Michael takes him trout fishing on a river called the Larmet. One day, Michael told me about the bullets streaming down from the sky while I put a night crawler onto a size 8 hook. Seriously, like rain, he said. The night crawler squirmed between my fingers, impaled. Bullets missed whatever they shot at way up on this one hill and fell down and whacked the Quonset hut he and his company always slept and ate in. Like hail, he said. Michael told me to be sure to leave some of Nightcrawler's tail wiggling free. He knocked them up so much, he said. The bullets bounced off the Quonset mostly harmlessly, he said, but he still didn't want to walk outside into that. He told me not to walk so heavy on the riverbanks. I thought I was being stealthy. That's why you only catch the little ones, he explained. You scare off all the keepers. Footfalls create sounds heard only by fish. Sound travels way faster in the water, he said. He stretched his arms out wide and wiggled his fingers like ripples. Later he pointed to a nice undercut bank and held his breath, no doubt hoping my cast wouldn't get hung up in the prickly ash bushes that bent into the river. Prickly ash is a really good name for those things. Next time on the river, he told me about a huge boat they had him stationed on for a really long time, the size of a city block. Not a whole lot for them to do while at sea, though. They're waiting for orders, he said. But one day they got to blow up an enemy ship. They split it in half with a deafening shell from over a mile away and watched it fold into the sea through a telescope. Otherwise, he should have got really fat on that boat. So fat he wouldn't get sent home because our dad had a thing about fat people. One morning, it was really hot on the Larmet. Michael picked me up at 4:30. I remember him shaking me awake. His sour breath on my face, his gold chain swinging from his neck. I was sweating before the sun came all the way up. He parked and we split up for a while. The nettles were just tall enough and just prickly enough to make pushing a path along the riverbank very unfun. Now just about to use a new fishing spot I found when I heard a distant whoop. Michael. Several whoops. A lunker. I made my way to him as fast as I could, but I couldn't find him anywhere on the river. I finally went back to his car. It took forever. I pulled out my waders and looked around. His fancy white-collar button-down shirt lay draped over the hood of his car. And there was Michael, sprawled out, bare-chested and asleep in the back seat, his thick forearms shielding his eyes. His hands were black with river dirt, the knees of his white bell-bottom jeans soiled and stained a dark green. Michael, I said. He groaned and rolled onto his side. I said his name again, but he didn't move. I pulled a can of Coke from his cooler. This the morning, Mom would be mad, but I didn't care. I was boiling hot, itchy all over from fighting those nettles. I was also really confused. Here we were, trout fishing on the famous Larmet River. My brother had just caught a lunker, and he was sleeping through it? How could anyone possibly sleep through that? Now, Michael nearly jumped out of his skin when I snapped the can open. He bolted upright and yelled and screamed something I couldn't understand. He knocked me over as he ran to the river and shoved his head into the water. I picked up my Coke. He walked back from the riverbank slowly and pulled his wet hair back over his head. He was growing it out. He repeated the story about bullets hitting the Quonset huts, all the people on that ship that sank. I asked about the whooping. Oh, he said. That was me. Yeah, I nodded. No kidding, he said. He rubbed the stubble on his chin and scratched at his lamb chop sideburns. Huh, he murmured. He had this far-off look in his eyes, and I knew not to say anything. Well, he said, I buried her. I shook my head. You what? I yelled. You buried it. Tuyen deserved a decent burial, he said. He stared at the long, wet weeds again and shrugged. She did, he insisted. He reached absently for my can of Coke. Come on, he said. Let's go to Mary's. Oh, I want to see that fish in the worst way. something live and fleshy from the glossy pages of field and stream. Then we sped away, kicking up gravel. Michael ate 2 specials. I figured he didn't get food like British Cafe while at war. I ordered pancakes and eggs, but I couldn't eat the eggs because the cook made them sunny side up. Michael laughed and ate my eggs for me. I told him about wanting to catch a lunker and have it mounted on my bedroom wall before he got home from Vietnam. Be like a surprise. He scraped his plate and got coffee. After a while, he said we could dig it up and tell everyone I caught it, the fish. I didn't like the idea, but I said okay anyway.
Thank you. And just one for now? Yeah?
What's that?
Just one for now? Yeah.
Just one for
What's
now.
that for now? Thank you. That was awesome. It was really... So, one thing to sort of lay the groundwork for tonight. I have had the pleasure of seeing every single one of these stories before it was finished. You know, when the ending was still sort of, no offense, you know, when it was in process. And then it's just really, really satisfying then to read these stories sort of all together as a collection and finished and just really in this great sparkling form. So this was really fun. It's really fun to hear you read it too. And so I just want to talk about like sort of what the book as a whole is about. And I told you I was going to ask this question, but I'm going to start. I'm going to tell you what it feels to me like it's about, and then you can tell me how I'm wrong, or maybe I got it right, and you can tell me, you know, that maybe it's at least a little bit right. But it really feels to me like this is a collection that is really sort of, it's deeply Midwestern. It is deeply what I would call Midwest Gothic. You know, it is sort of about the strangeness and the weirdness of this place we live in, especially the upper Midwest. Some of the themes of the book are themes of, I think, sort of isolation. Characters are trapped in their own heads. Sometimes they're trapped in their own homes. They're trapped in their own homes, sometimes because of the pandemic and sometimes because of the weather. And even when they're out, they're in these communities and they're sort of members of these, you know, small town communities, and yet we sort of feel this isolation from the rest of the world. And this sense of being trapped is sometimes this tension in the books, and then things get weird. You know, and sometimes they get weird because of trauma, or sometimes they get weird because, you know, mice start talking. So that feels to me like a lot of what this book is about. I could be completely making that up though. What do you think it's about? Or you could probably pull that one down.
Oh, probably.
If you want. Just nice to make sure everyone can hear. I have a soft voice.
I was not the AV guy at my school. It explains my career in software engineering. Yeah, I think you pretty much nail it. You know, I love the characters in my books and my stories. I love them a lot. They have this really powerful connection to their setting, and I didn't realize really till today. I was thinking about it. They're outside in their setting a lot. Doesn't really matter what the weather's like. They're outside doing something, and yeah, it's about obsession and about their anxiety, and a lot of times they're processing loss and just kind of the absurdity of it all. And I do like finding kind of the bizarre and the very benign and just normal. And I don't remember what else you just said, but yeah, I think you pretty much described it well. It's just a lot of time inside of people's heads. People perseverate about separate different things. It's a lot of different voices and perspectives, points of view in the book. Some of the, you know, that story I just read is first person. Some stories are written in second person, some stories are written in third person. Some are written in very close third, and some are written in a really distant third, and varying voice. I think that's important too.
Yeah, that feels really important. I think, you know, there's something with these characters that are stuck inside their head, and then there is this motion almost with the stories, like what happens when they do break out, which, you know, the story will be sort of, it feels like it's almost the structure. And I write a lot of stories, and I feel like the structure I use is anxiety, you know, where you're sort of circling around and around and around, and you almost can't escape. And then finally at the end, you know, we find an escape, and the escape is maybe not what was expected. You know, that what they look at is maybe not really what they were anticipating. Is that something that's important to you when you're thinking about stories, or?
I think it just kind of comes out. You know, somebody asked me once, well, what's the book about? And I said, well, it's a collection of stories. It's literary fiction. Well, what's literary fiction? You know, and then you get stuck. You know, you try not to be too reductive with it, but one example, is girl meets boy, girl loses boy, girl never sees boy again. You know, the stories don't always quite end on a typical story arc, but they kind of just turn out the way I end up writing them. I don't necessarily say, oh, it's going to end this way, or I need to insert a certain twist. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's fun to throw rocks at your characters, and I tend to kind of punish the people in my stories a lot, but it doesn't mean I don't like them. I mean, some of them die, and I still write about them and bring them back. And,
I always think that, like when you write a character and they die, but you let them live in the first place. It wouldn't, it better to put them in the book and kill them than to just never imagine them. My goodness.
yeah,
Right?
totally. I'll go with that. Yeah, I like it for sure. I did one of the writers groups I was in about 8 years ago. Every story had something dying, a dog or a person or whatever, and finally I said, I got to lighten up a little bit. So I wrote the story, and it's about this guy. You actually worked with the story about a guy. He's going to get a gift for his new neighbors. So he's perseverating and going through like what all the neighbors are going to make for these people who are moving in. Like they're going to make brownies. They're going to make zucchini bread. They're going to make this. He decides he's going to make a pie, and he just goes through all these different kinds of pies, and he takes the pie to these people. They talk for a while, and then he leaves. And that's the story, right? And I had laid the seed with the writers group that something terrible is about to happen always. So this really innocuous story about a guy making an apple pie, but the worst thing that happens is he forgot the cheddar cheese to go with the pie, and they're really stressed the members of the group out because nothing happened.
I mean, that makes me think about two things. That makes me think about, okay, first of all, we punish our characters to reveal who they are, right? We're sort of getting this burnished soul that we get closer and closer to what we can really say about human beings, about people. But then the other thing, like, is you look at, so there's a lot of the absurd in your book. I think there's a lot of absurd in my book too. But there's something about that, like, when you look at the absurd, so it is absurd to have a story about nothing but making a pie, and it is absurd to think that, a character has invested so much into making this pie, then you look at it and it's just this silly thing, and it's also really, really bleak. That this person has let their happiness rest on whether or not they remember cheddar cheese. And that is like, it is deeply depressing. And the absurd is always that, right? The absurd is always, there's something silly and ridiculous, and we can sort of chuckle at it. But the literary meaning of the absurd is life is meaningless because we're all going to die. So, and when you put these things in this book, when you put this silly, and you talked about a story that isn't in this collection, so, which is
True.
Also a bit absurd.
Yeah. Good point.
But so we have like sort of a talking mouse, it's incredibly, it's kind of silly, it's kind of ridiculous, and the circumstances that bring out this talking mouse, and the way we sort of relate to it, is deeply devastating. The reason the mouse is there and what we're learning about through that, and sort of again and again, there's this story in this book where is this beautiful, hideous image of trees that are planted for the sole purpose of collecting plastic bags that are blowing around and polluting the earth. Okay, this is a story in some country. I don't think it's one you're going to read, so I'm not spoiling anything. But like that image on its own is beautiful and really frightening. That they are just these plastic bags flapping around in the tree, and so we suddenly get both. And that becomes a complex emotion. We get a complex response. The world is not simple, and I think stories that make us understand that the world is not simple are the ones I want to read. Is that something that you think about or work with?
Constantly.
When you're coming with, yeah.
It's hard not to. That story she's referring to is called Yardnary, and you can go into dystopia, but this sort of also, I think, just helps tell a deeper truth. I think just kind of magnifies and draws two lines beneath it, and for me, it's like somebody asked, "Well, why are these so dark?" And not necessarily, but it's a little therapeutic. But also, I just notice things at random, while walking around, and it's kind of hard not to see a little dystopia in some of it. You know, like our elementary school in our neighborhood sustained quite a bit of roof damage in a storm last spring. They didn't start to repair the roof until 2 weeks before school resumed the next fall. So to do that, they put a huge crane in the middle of the playground, and the crane was dragging these huge pallets over the playground on top of the school during the school day, right? And I'm walking my dog by, I'm like, wow. And then those pallets look like, have you heard of the security pods that some schools are installing? So they're like these large bulletproof, they are bulletproof lockers. They look like these veal barns in the schools where the children could take shelter if there's an active shooter. School districts are installing those. And if God, that looks like those, you know, it'd have been easy to start a rumor right there. But I'm like, no, it's for fixing the roof. This is when the contract came, this is when they could do it, the supply chain, the whole deal, right? But still, it's like, wow, you know, the image of that. But, so it's kind of hard not to think like, you know, at some point some of these human systems aren't working quite the way we would expect them to. And to me, that's absurd, and it's perhaps dystopian, but it's every day just walking my dog, stuff you see.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question or the connection between some of these stories. I'm wondering if you, because you're thinking about you're going to read another one too. Would
Yep.
you do that first, or should I ask the question first?
I can read that one.
Your call. Yeah.
Sure. All right.
Make sure to have time.
Yeah. Right. So I'll read again, not a super long part from the title story, Sometimes Creek, and I'm going to drop you also kind of in the last third of the story. Just lost my page. So to put you in place here, I can't see without, I can't read with these glasses, I can't see without. Let's see, following the death of his wife, this guy, this man, the narrator, has moved with his daughter to kind of an expensive rental home on a leafy, really well put together, well maintained street near the fall. So Halloween is coming. The street is also known as Halloween Street. His daughter's name is Claire. He lives across the street from a woman named Rain. Rain has a daughter named Jasmine, and she becomes fast friends with Claire, and she's also nonverbal, and Jasmine teaches Claire American Sign Language. Time exhales and cascades out of control, off the rails. The lateral waterfalls sprawl. October? It's a month that's appeared here before me, spun like a scarf from a hole in the middle of this Halloween street air, an air that now quickens with anticipation and a certain anxiety, like a prolonged breath held trapped within a lung for an extra second, and then another. Pumpkins line every porch top, and it just now occurred to me that not only does every house on the street boast a spacious front porch, each porch has a flat rooftop, and each flat rooftop is now lined with pumpkins. Not jack-o'-lanterns just yet, though it's been cold enough for those. Jasmine across the street signs something that reminds me that I haven't put away all the day's shopping, and a couple of new things happen all at once. The first is that it looks like I started to put things away, like groceries and yet more Halloween candy, but I became again distracted and wandered away from the bulk spices and the dry goods into some remote brain ether. In this case, to observe the twirling, twisting, dying, dead leaves. Then a weight presses deliberately across the back of my shoulders into my shoulder blades. Ghosts only get lost for a little while. Do they stop to ask for directions? Who or what would they ask? And how? Maybe they sign too, like Jasmine and Claire. I don't know. But I'm relatively convinced that a motivated ghost will eventually find you. And this pressure upon my back is not entirely new. It's been creeping into me at random since the funeral. It's not just startling at first, but once settled in, I don't want to leave. The only thing I dread, in fact, is its departure, wondering if this time will be the last. I mentioned this to a work colleague over lunch. She doesn't even look up from her soup, but she tells me calmly that I'm a natural draw for those new at being dead. I nearly dropped my sandwich. So Bulk spices, among other items, still need a home to be put away. At my replacement house here, from which I'm trying to carve a home, I repurpose empty spice jars, new labels for old spice and herb containers, a new replace creation of what it will contain from the old. The empty jar in my hand will become dried peppermint, and I suppose I do replace, like that one poet said, women mourn, men replace. But Sylvia isn't a thing. She's not empty. The only thing empty is this jar in my hand. I turn it between my fingers and wish I could climb inside and twist the lid. I close my eyes. Once upon a time, there's a man who didn't want to replace, didn't want to move on, didn't want to just get over it. Savory becomes oregano, thyme becomes tarragon, clove becomes coriander, and funnel becomes anise. I open my eyes, look up out the front window across the street. Warm anise wafts in from Sometimes Creek, where beautiful rain makes black licorice. She offered me a piece the other day. I hesitated. Go ahead, she urged. She smiled secretively. What? You never had homemade licorice before? She laughed quietly, coiled a length of hair over her ear. Come on, she cackled, like I was being silly. She nudged me at the plate. It's even gluten-free.
Thanks. And forget that old question I was going to ask. Let's talk about ghosts. Let's talk about ghosts. Why do you write about ghosts? You've got a couple stories about ghosts, or with ghosts, in varying degrees of, I would say, in varying degrees of certainty. You have varying degrees of certainty in the ghosts about whether or not they are sort of real ghosts or a literary ghost, which is maybe just a memory, or somebody just sort of imagining what might not be there. But ghosts do appear in several places.
Yeah, a friend of mine, anybody here know Brad Nelson? Professor at, professor at, it doesn't matter, but he teaches literature in Montreal. He said, well, a lot of your characters are ghosts, even the real one, they're not ghosts, but your characters are like ghosts. I never really thought about that, but I think my characters are kind of haunted. There's something there's a yearning and there's some deep desire that's in them all. And they're just perpetually haunted. And occasionally, I make them ghosts. And my characters are pretty empathic, I think. There's one woman in a different story who can sense what somebody's feeling literally through a brick wall. Or looking at a picture or talking to them on the phone, she can feel their emotions. And pretty sensitive and just to the bone kind of people. And the stories, I kind of see it's a tough road to hoe, I think, but it's kind of worth it because they're very real and gut punchy, but they also straddle this liminal space on the other side of like the speculative or plausible magic that happens with this dash of something else that's just off center from where a mainstream story might flow, and ghosts seem to kind of fit that ethereal presence.
Yeah, because they are real.
Totally real.
It makes me think too about how, so getting closer to what I said I was going to forget about talking about, but like the, when you have literal ghosts in a story, and then you have a story also where a ghost might be figurative, or a ghost might be in somebody's imagination, how these stories interact with each other is something I like to think about, when I'm reading a collection. And I know not everybody reads a collection straight through, start to finish. You probably should, though. Writers usually take a lot of care, in the order that it all happens and in how the stories influence each other. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about that, about how you think that these stories, work together.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly picked the stories for a reason. It's not just because, they're all written within like the last few years, but yeah, they do speak to each other. Some stories are linked. I have a hard time not seeing everything as being interconnected. I've used the analogy of the crossword before, but where my characters are so strong, my stories are mostly character-driven. Their storylines are like solutions to a crossword puzzle that eventually intersect. And there's a moment where these two storylines and the lives of these people, their arcs, share this one common space. It's like the one letter that's both solutions have in common. And it's at that point where maybe a dialogue happens or an interaction, or they just bump carts at the store or something, or whatever, right? And then the solution continues and people's lives go on whichever way. I usually grab onto one of those and finish writing about, but I never forget about the other life, because that's just part of this fabric that pulls our society together. And no one's a secondary character in their own story, right? So that person often will get bent back into a different story of their own. And some of these stories do link that way, where you may recognize a character from somewhere else, but it happens pretty organically, naturally. It's not like a forced thing where I'm trying to make these all work together.
I like what you're saying there a lot. I definitely, something I noticed when we first started working together is I would read one of your stories, and there would be character X who had a passing, conversation with character Y, and I'm like, I wonder if character Y will ever come back. And sure enough, a couple months later, I would get the story about character Y. But I think that what you're saying about like characters not being, nobody's a secondary character in their own story, like that sense of a person being real and complex and round, even if they're only showing up for a little while in this world, that makes the world bigger. And that's a really important thing when reading a story, that we're not using a character, we're not inventing a person just to push the plot. I think that's disrespectful of the character. But this sense of, even if this isn't their story, that they have one. Mm-hmm. And this this connecting web of stories that are collected and connect this way, it gives me a sense that, okay, maybe I don't have the story of this other character who appears, but they probably have one. That feels important to me.
Yeah, and I think if you treat that person like they are, validates that character more. It makes the story you're writing stronger, or the character you're writing better, just by having someone who matters more.
And maybe the rest of their story, even if it doesn't appear. I think too, when we think about how these stories are connected, that's where the sense of place like really bubbles, to the top for me. I said at the beginning that this feels, sort of deeply, grotesquely Midwestern. It's sort of this small town, Wisconsin. This place is not only, it not only repeats, it not only is very present, it feels very important to who these characters are. So I wonder, does that mean that, how do you feel about place? Is that important to you when you're crafting the stories? Does that reflect something about your beliefs regarding place?
I'm not sure. A lot of it.
Or this place.
Yeah, right. Just a lot of it. A lot of it just comes out so subconsciously. There are times when I'll write something and I'll look at it the next morning and I'm surprised by what's been written. Because it just kind of flows. I kind of go into this little, I won't call it a fugue, but just this trance almost where I'm just writing about stuff. And I think I'm just pulling it from somewhere. I didn't really think of these stories as so profoundly deep Midwestern until the blurbs started coming. I'd ask these writers, could you send me something, and that's what I got. Glitters and Midwestern dust. I'm like, what the hell is Midwestern dust? And more of that. And I was like, God, am I being limited by calling it that? And then I met a writer at Matt Bell at Wisconsin Book Festival. He's like, no, it's a good thing, really. You're not, because having a really strong, really, anchored into a certain place is more likely good things, not wishy-washy. People have commented, like, people from Texas, in New Jersey, they say, God, this feels like a story I read about where I grew up, even though it's taking place in Noisy Creek, Wisconsin, or wherever I put the story, right? One thing that's kind of funny, that what I read about Halloween Street, it's the street I live on actually is known for its outrageous, it's like a theme park of Halloween displays. Somebody in my writer tip said, oh, you didn't quite get this point right. I'm like, I wasn't writing about our street. They celebrate Halloween in other cities, and in fact, one great thing about the good thing about the pandemic, I guess, was I was able to participate in workshops like in Portland and in Austin, Texas, and in Brooklyn, with writers from all over via Zoom, where otherwise I'd have to fly there and write. I'm not going to do that. And that's what all these people said. Oh my God, it sounds like the town in California I just grew up in. That same image of people just kind of spending as much on Halloween as they would Christmas.
So you're bringing up the these stories were written some of these stories are written in pandemic times, and I just want to say, like, I don't know, you know, if we have at least a few writers in the audience, but like, it takes a long time to put a book together. So if these stories were written about something like that, is kind of remarkable that they can be in the book if they were written about something that has happened as recently, you know, as this started. And there's something to me, even like, we're just starting to see pandemic stories really come out and to see what literature is coming from it. And that's just because, you know, publishing takes forever. But I mean, I haven't really written about it yet. I feel like I tend to need some distance. And I wonder how you feel about having these stories here that are so new and are also about something that everybody in the world experienced, and maybe we don't know the shape of it yet, and yet you're already right. That feels brave to me. Does that make you nervous at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes and no. I mean, you know, one of the stories that does address an epidemic specifically was actually, I'd started writing it before the pandemic, and it was supposed to be a nod to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. The idea was that it had the same idea of burning. It just, then the pandemic came, and you know, I made a joke. Actually, I wasn't joking. Like, so am I gonna have to burn my clothes every day when I get home from going to work? You know, and I thought, I got this story that involves people burning stuff, you know, at random. So I kind of went with that. Other stories, yeah, you know, people probably don't want to read stories about a pandemic while they're living through a pandemic. So, yeah, that was a huge concern, you know. But at the same time,
I mean, I guess I think, like, do you feel like you have wisdom on it yet?
No.
Already so soon. And that's where I get nervous. Like, I need to know what I think. So that feels I'm impressed. It feels really brave. This is not meant to be like, why did you do that? It was, how did you manage?
It could be foolish, you know. But no, I'm not really giving away any specific knowledge about the pandemic or what it's like to live through it or anything like that. I don't think. One of the pandemic stories I wrote was kind of an escape, and you know, I could read a chunk from that if you want. But
yeah, I mean, I think that we talked about, like, that feels to me like if you would read that story, that would give this lovely sense of the shape of the book, because of the way the first stories that you read are sort of that enclosed, and then this is just a little breath.
Yeah, okay.
So, you don't have to, but that seems like that might be a good way to give a sense of it all.
Yeah, so it was a night a lot like tonight. It was 35 below zero, and we were deep in pandemic and shelter in place, and there weren't any vaccines yet. Yeah, so it was just like we couldn't do anything. The story's called "I Prefer You" in Spanish, and I'm going to read a different part than I thought I'd read, just based on what you said. But the story does open up a little bit, and so I call it a pandemic story because of when I wrote it and the need I had to kind of just, for two things, to write something kind of different from the feel of these other stories in the book. This is more of a distant third person, almost a fairy tale feel, and it's about somewhere else. And that's kind of what I needed at the time, was just to go to a different place, even if only in my brain for a little while. So I'll just read like first couple pages of this. So I prefer you in Spanish. I prefer you in Spanish, she says. She sets down her glass. So please, she says in Spanish, don't speak to me in English. She doesn't wait for him to say anything. Thank you, she says, and exhales loudly. They fell in love in Salamanca. It didn't take long. They were meant for each other. She's from Connecticut. He is from somewhere in Michigan. Her parents are from Madrid and his mother's from Lima. She wants to live in Rio de Janeiro, and he insists that Lake Superior will never let him go. A college-aged boy smiles at the girl across the table from him at the outdoor cafe at the Plaza Mayor in Salamanca and pours beer. He taps the heels of his hard shoes on the centuries-old stone floor beneath his feet. Walls of the enclosed plaza throb a sandstone golden gleam at the city's ancient center. A waiter dressed in black, bearing a platter of bowls filled with aromatic salads and plates heaped with toasted tomato and basil sandwiches, dodges a pair of darting children. It's your accent, she says. Oh yeah, and geez, and super. She wears a light cream blouse. Petals of muted roses arc in tight stitches across a dark brown skirt. She recrosses her legs and looks around the Plaza Mayor. A discarded page of newsprint tumbles across the stone sections of the plaza and becomes wedged in the legs of a folding chair resting against a table at the next cafe. Students waiting in clusters pace about beneath the main clock tower beyond. You make me sound Canadian, he grumbles. Yes, she says, you're practically all Canada anyway. North Dakota, Manitoba, Michigan, Iowa. What difference does it make, the girl says. She moves her hands a lot when she speaks. You're all Ontario to us. He notices a girl with shiny hair walk by. She wears a red skirt and yellow sleeveless blouse. The girl across from him scoops her black bangs aside and nods to the passing yellow sleeveless. She's pretty, she says, also watching. She raises an eyebrow in a way that drives the boy wild. Yes, he said. He clears his throat. She is. The pretty girl in yellow top and red skirt disappears behind a pillar of a wide Baroque arch. He looks back at the girl across from him. The yellow top girl is indeed pretty, though the boy knows in his heart that he'll never know anyone as beautiful to him as this green-eyed girl sitting across from him now. She got nothing on you, he says. You, my dear, he says, are gorgeous, stunning. The girl snorts. There you go again, she says in Spanish. With that damn accent, I'm begging you, she says. I adore you, but please lose the English. I just don't like you in English. I'm sorry, I just don't. He folds his arms and looks around for the waiter and back at the arch. His beer is empty, and the pretty girl in the red and yellow is gone. That, and you're just so much less interesting in English, she says in Spanish. They're quiet for a while. Same thing doesn't happen to you, the boy says. You certainly don't become some duller just for speaking your native tongue. Spanish? No, silly. English? Maybe, she says in frowns. I don't know. I think about things in Spanish about as often as I do in English. What if I told you Spanish is my native tongue? Bah, it's not. It can't be. You grew up, my parents are Spanish, she says. Spaniards grew up in Connecticut. Madrid, Spain, in fact, she says. People, she says, folding her arms across her chest. Of Spain, she gives a resolute nod. Doesn't matter, he says in English. You're nothing but East Coast. He stares at her for an extra moment and smiles. It's on your breath.
I mean, so even when we take this step away, you know, it is from, right? It is from this place. And that this step away even emphasizes we have this long conversation of, you know, about place, about where this kid is from, and then it is only sort of, you know, emphasizing, you know, when we take that break, you know, it's reminding us of, you know, the cold.
Yeah, another thing's banging around my brain too. You know, I mean, Spanish is pretty important to me. But I love language, and I love playing with language. I invent words and I stick them into stories, and I make up things that hopefully make sense. I spend a lot of time choosing the words based on what they look like, how they sound together, how they feel. Yeah, but to me that story does open up, and I could have picked a different section too, but it's definitely.
Perfect for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Anything else?
Should we audience questions?
Do other people have questions? I don't know. Yeah, is it time? Is it a good time for that?
Okay.
I mean, I was a little curious about knowing that you've lived in many different places, and that last story gets a little bit to it, but like how much of the rest of the world comes to visit small town Wisconsin with these stories?
In this book, not as much. I have started writing, it's almost like a February tradition now, where I write stories like the one I prefer in Spanish. I've got one called Swimming in Paraguay. I've got one called The Tormes Tug. But I've started writing more about my experiences abroad. I don't know, one day it just suddenly occurred to me, you know, because I've got all these memories of these places I've lived. I should probably pick them up, but it's just kind of easier to write about a place when you're living in it, living through it. But yeah, this connection, it's a collection. It's that's definitely an outlier, but it still works with the rest of the stories, I think. Cause
I find the opposite is true. I don't write as much. I don't write where I live. I write about before. I don't know. It's interesting.
yeah, I was going to ask you a question too. But,
You want?
so with all the craft work you do, writing. Allison Wyss's website is amazing. There's like 100 articles on craft. She's really good at pulling apart how stories work and why, and examining just these aspects of each writer. It's really, really cool. You're welcome. And I mean, and I will hand her this knot of a story. It's got like all these confused threads in it, and she'll help me focus on like what's important. Like, okay, you know how to pick out the story. Just stick with this, To what extent, though, does writing craft and helping other people like me write have an impact on your creative process?
Well, first I want to say, thank you. But what I think about when you say that, like when I hope, what pleased me the most reading this book was when I found things that I know I recommended against. Like it's really, really important to me that I'm not taking over your stories,
Yeah.
and there are definite lines there, and I'm like, I'm sure, I could look it up, because you have to have your own voice, even when you're working with other people, and maybe that's one of the things that I've really learned. Writers, it's this collaboration, right? We're always sharing, we're always getting feedback, we're always learning from each other, but you still have to somehow figure out who you are, in relation to all this feedback you're getting, in relation to, suggestions, and sometimes super prescriptive things, and sometimes people taking over a story. And I think that, one of the things I like to do, like with all of my craft writing, is interrogate my taste, figure out what I love, and sort of find ways that, are not necessarily that standard prescriptive advice, that stories can work sort of outside of, the rules we get in workshops. So that's a thing that, I think my stories get weirder because I'm looking for weird things. And I'm looking for, I'll find a rule, and I'll think, yeah, but what if I do the opposite? Because I don't think of them as rules, I think of them as tools, and strategies. So, like, oh, look, the way this sentence was constructed created this effect. What if I want to create the opposite? Well, what if I try to just do the opposite thing? Let's see. So it's a lot of playing with words, playing with other people's stories. When I help somebody with a story, and I identify a problem, though, and then I don't have to fix it, that is amazing. That is really, really fun. Because when I find the problem in my own story and I have to figure it out. So I don't know, it feeds into each other. I'm really lucky that I get to do it. I think, people, I'm probably talking too long about this. I get excited. Sometimes people count the books they've read, like over the course of the year, and they have these goals, and like that these published books are the only way that they're like learning and proving who they are. And I get to read all these unpublished stories by people who, are maybe just brand new to it, or maybe really good, or maybe not very good. But like even when a story in a lot of ways doesn't work, there's still wisdom there. And I get to see inside people's brains, and somebody's like, I've never done this before in my whole life, and I don't really know how stories work, but I'm trying this. And you just sort of get to wade through their sentences and figure out something about the way their mind works and their experience of the world. It's beautiful. It's really intimate. It is really vulnerable, and I'm so lucky I get to see that for just human beings in the world. I love it.
Yeah, and writers group can help with that too a little bit. You get to see people's works in progress, and you'll come across like 2 paragraphs that are really well written, but there's no story there. Or that's one thing I've learned. Kind of, there's a difference between good writing and good storytelling. And a great story is both. So.
And also I think it's all culturally based. What we say is good, like it's about sort of it's meeting our expectations or not. Do you have any questions for?
Steve,
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you got a master's in Spanish literature.
Master's in Spanish.
Oh.
So I started with that's all they call it, MA in Spanish, all but dissertation, but it's not literature. It's just called Spanish. I was emphasizing literature, but I couldn't deal with literary theory. Not so much that it was just too woo-woo for me, but to me it just dissected the work too much.
It freezes you sometimes to think too hard about it. Is that sort of that? I've had that experience with theory before.
Yeah, and so I lean more towards linguistics. I was really involved in the evolution of Latin into Spanish and Portuguese and French, and how we got here with the versions of it, and reading the manuscripts and stuff to prove it. And that part to me was really pretty cool, and I didn't have to mangle somebody, some great writers. And some of those writers I did read are, like Julio Cortázar is probably one of my biggest, he's no longer with us, but the writers that I really admire now aren't still living, and it's like I swear every time I pick up the New Yorker, I'm like, oh God, I want to write just like this person, but I think that's just part of absorbing new and different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
So, does that clarify?
It does. And have you always liked to write?
Yeah.
Like from what age?
But
I grew up with this kid, but I don't know.
So that's my sister. It's one of my sisters over there too. Yeah, so it's about 7 or 8 writing stories, and I, instead of doing the English assignment in middle school, I'd write a story and hand that in. And Mrs. Wilcox is pretty nice. Do you remember Mrs. Wilcox? Yeah. And so these 2 people here had Mrs. Wilcox. Anyway, but I always knew it was something I could go back to, and then like even in grad school, while suffering through the literary theory classes, I wrote as Rebellion. There are 2 novels I wrote that are trunk novels and will always remain trunk novels. But I just knew it was always there. People in my family lived to be about 100. I figured, I can always come back to this. And then, about 10 years ago, I was like, well, even if you're talented, you still got to develop that talent. It doesn't matter if it's sculpture or painting or soccer. You got to work at it. And that's what, about 10 years ago, I started taking it way more seriously again. So, does that help?
It does. Helps me understand the guy I grew up with.
Do you think it's weird for people in your life to read your stories?
A little bit. You said to me once, you got to be careful who you let read your stories. Yeah. One of the stories I let slip out, and people in the neighborhood saw, the story's called Dumplings. That's all I'm going to say. About a man and a dog. And it slipped out, and I started getting dirty looks around the neighborhood. That wasn't supposed to be shared. Right? But it got out. It's supposed to be a scary story for Halloween, actually.
Yeah, there are parents at my kids' school that won't make eye contact with me, and it's either because they read my book or they didn't, right? But it's probably
Which is worse, you can't
I
be
don't
sure.
know.
Oh, it's funny. So, any other questions? I've done all the talking, but Allison's been wonderful to work with. Yes, sir, Jim?
How'd you pick the cover? I know where it is. It's in Hudson.
So, yeah, this publishing experience is pretty good compared to other writers. One writer I saw here actually, Nick Butler, was talking about his book. It's a canoe on a lake, and there's not a single scene in his book that's got a canoe on a lake. So they've got good designers, but that's just how it is. Publishers said this is how it is. They did pick the title for me. They like the speculative kind of blurriness of it. I'm not sure if I'd have chosen that for a title or not. Actually, the original title was Beautiful Rain Makes Black Licorice. That was the original title of that story. And also, speaking of gluten-free licorice, I made some today. It's in that tray there for you all. You have some? My hands were clean. These are the stars that inspired a story called The Butcher's Ghost, which is in the book. And I remember I posted on Facebook a photograph of the stairs going up. And I said, why hasn't anybody written a story about these steps yet? Because 6th Street just stops at the base of this bluff. It's like somebody just dropped the bluff on top of the road. It's very weird. And then there's a staircase that goes up. And at the right angle, at the right time, it looked like it just keeps going. So I imagine this community living on top of this, like a butte almost. Just there's like a cigar shop and a chocolatier and the Butcher's Ghost. I guess you'll have to read the story. But we went through a lot of iterations, and finally I said, I've got the photographs I think would work. So I sent that to her, and she did the reverse out to kind of give it that spooky feel. And I got to pick the font, and I was really lucky to get a blurb from Amber Sparks. I'm really just shocked at some named writers that responded to me, and they didn't have to email me back, and say like I'm too busy or whatever. But they did. It was just very weird and pretty cool. The writers' community's been great until Elon
Writers'
Musk.
community's
Until
great.
Elon Musk came along and ruined Twitter for everyone. Mastodon. So, anyway, does that answer your question? Okay.
I thought the base of it looked like a creek, because I don't recognize, because I didn't grow up in Hudson.
Yeah, and actually, Stephanie and I lived, our house is like down here. We followed, this is the street we grew up on. Or
You shouldn't tell people where you live.
like they know. We live by the stairs. Yeah.
We can probably do one more question. Yeah.
Could you talk about, I may have missed it, your connection or how, like the,
I teach classes at the law.
Okay.
I first met Steve maybe 8 years ago, not quite 10 probably, but somewhere in that range when he took a law class.
okay.
Yeah, it was called 8 Weeks, 8 Drafts.
I'm teaching it again now.
Are you?
Yes.
It's a great class. At first, I wasn't ready for it. It was just over my head, and God, the writers in there are just incredible too. The woman who runs that place up in Madeline Island. Anyway, there's some great girl. I can't think of her name, but anyway, this one woman is writing this historical novel, and the research she did. It's like, oh, don't you research your story? I'm like, well, sometimes I look something up, but you know, she was getting like this dill pickle recipe correct, and all these details about race relations in this hotel, and how, you know, people dressed in the boots they wore, and I looked at her, I said, God, I don't know, I just make shit up. I mean, honestly, if I have to know, like one of the stories I had to read about bats, so I had to know a little bit more about bats that I already know, or, you know, there could probably a few more examples. Sometimes it's nice to be able to teach people, you know, the plastic bags thing, you know, you can educate the reader without being didactic, hopefully.
Yeah, I like to make things up too. There's this thing about like, you know, like I write the story first, and then I'm like, I should research a little bit, and I'm like, oh, those facts don't fit. Okay, never mind. I didn't read it.
Does that make you more or less reliable?
More.
Totally.
It's different ways of knowing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but it was a lot of fun, and like she said, with the publishing industry, it's like 2 years almost to get a book.
Wow.
Yeah,
You know, so once you sign the contract and it actually hits a bookshelf somewhere, it's 18 months.
well, I think you can be really proud of it. I think
Well, thanks.
this has been a great event. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
This is great. This is really fun. Thank you for reading.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for talking about it.
Thanks for letting me take all the time.
As it goes. It's your time. This is